Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Treated as less than because of how you look? In this video, we're going to show you a story that hits close to home for many of us. It's about Mark, a man who experienced blatant discrimination on his own airline. As you watch, think about times you've faced prejudice or seen others treated unfairly. How did it make you feel? What did you do? Mark's story will challenge you to consider, what would you do if you had the power to change things? Get ready for a journey that might just inspire you to stand up against injustice in your own life. Mark settled into his plush first-class seat, taking in the bustling activity around him. Passengers hurried to stow their bags and find their spots. Some looked frazzled, others excited. A mix of business suits and vacation wear filled the cabin. As the last stragglers boarded, a flight attendant appeared. Her name tag read, Cindy. She moved efficiently down the aisle, smile plastered on as she began drink service. But Mark noticed something off. Cindy's demeanor shifted subtly as she interacted with different passengers. To some, she was all charm and warmth. "What can I get for you today, sir?" she'd ask with a dazzling grin. But to others, her tone cooled. "Drinks?" she'd say curtly, barely making eye contact before moving on. The pattern was clear. Cindy fawned over well-dressed passengers but dismissed those in casual clothes. She lingered chatting with an older white couple while rushing a young man in a hoodie. Her bias was showing. When Cindy reached Mark's row, he gave her a friendly smile. "Coffee, please. No cream or sugar." Cindy's eyes flicked over him, taking in his appearance. Her lips tightened. "Fine," she said flatly, reaching for a cup. Mark watched as she poured his coffee, movements sharp and impatient. She thrust the cup at him without a word, already turning away. But her haste was her undoing. The cup tilted, sending a wave of scalding liquid straight at Mark's face. Time seemed to slow. Mark saw the horror dawn in Cindy's eyes as she realized what was happening, but she made no move to stop it. The coffee hit Mark's skin with a painful hiss. He let out a gasp of shock and pain. Other passengers turned to stare. Mark's shirt was soaked, his face red and stinging. Steam rose from the mess. Cindy stood frozen, mouth agape. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mark locked eyes with her. His gaze was steady, patient, waiting to see what she would do. The tension stretched. Would she apologize? Offer help? Make excuses? The other passengers watched with bated breath. In that moment, Cindy's true colors showed. She snapped her mouth shut, lips twisting in disdain. Without a word of apology or concern, she spun on her heel and marched away, leaving Mark to deal with the burns himself. Shocked murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. How could she just walk away? The blatant disregard was stunning. As Mark dabbed at his shirt with a napkin, he couldn't help but wonder. If he'd been a different race or looked wealthier, would Cindy have reacted the same? The answer seemed clear. This wasn't just an accident. It was discrimination, plain as day. As the reality of Cindy's actions sank in, a tense hush fell over the cabin. How would the other passengers respond to this blatant act of discrimination? Their reactions were about to reveal more than just shock and challenge everything we think we know about standing up to injustice. Mark sat there, coffee dripping from his face, as dozens of eyes darted between him and Cindy's retreating form. The air crackled with tension. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do or say. Some whispered to their seatmates, while others pretended to be engrossed in their magazines or phones. Despite the burning sensation on his skin, Mark remained remarkably composed. He calmly dabbed at his face with a napkin, his expression neutral. This calm demeanor seemed to unsettle the other passengers even more. They'd expected shouting, maybe even a confrontation. But Mark's quiet dignity in the face of such disrespect was somehow more powerful than any outburst could have been. As the minutes ticked by, the bystander effect took hold. Everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first move, to speak up, to offer help, to demand accountability. But no one did. The weight of collective inaction hung heavy in the air. Finally, a middle-aged woman in the row behind Mark broke the silence. She leaned forward, offering him a packet of tissues. "I can't believe she did that," she murmured, her voice a mix of sympathy and disbelief. "Are you okay?" Mark accepted the tissues with a grateful nod. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied softly. His measured response seemed to give others permission to react. A few more passengers began to mutter disapprovingly about Cindy's behavior. But still, no one called for the flight attendant or demanded to speak to a supervisor. The incident had exposed an uncomfortable truth. Even in the face of clear discrimination, many people struggled to intervene. As Mark cleaned himself up, he couldn't help but reflect on the situation. If they only knew who he really was, would it change how they reacted? Would it make them more likely to speak up? Or was this silence a deeper reflection of society's hesitation to confront racism head-on? He decided not to reveal his identity just yet. This wasn't about him using his position to demand special treatment. It was about something much bigger. Mark wanted to see how the situation would play out naturally. He was gathering information, observing not just Cindy's behavior, but the reactions of everyone around him. The flight was far from over, and Mark had a feeling there was more to come. He settled back in his seat, outwardly calm but inwardly alert. The other passengers might have thought the incident was over, but for Mark, it was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The coffee incident was just the tip of the iceberg. As the flight progressed, Cindy's behavior exposed a deeper, more insidious problem lurking beneath the surface of polite society. How many more passengers would fall victim to her biased treatment before someone took action? Mark watched Cindy like a hawk for the rest of the flight. He noticed a clear pattern in her interactions with passengers. To those she deemed worthy, usually older, well-dressed, or light-skinned travelers, Cindy was all smiles and attentive service. She'd linger at their seats, chatting and refilling drinks without being asked. But for others, it was a different story. Mark observed as Cindy practically ignored a young man in a hoodie who politely requested a blanket. She rolled her eyes when a woman with a thick accent asked for help with her tray table. And when an elderly lady of color requested assistance with her bag, Cindy huffed and puffed as if it was a massive inconvenience. The stark contrast in treatment was impossible to ignore. Cindy's judgmental glances spoke volumes. She'd scan passengers from head to toe, her expression shifting based on what she saw. Designer labels got a smile. Casual wear or non-Western clothing earned a frown. Mark felt his blood pressure rising with each new slight he witnessed. He wanted nothing more than to stand up and reveal his true identity as the airline's owner. To call Cindy out on her behavior then and there, but he held back. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about exposing a systemic problem. So Mark bided his time. He made mental notes of each incident. The way Cindy forgot to bring water to the row with several passengers of color, how she spoke slowly and loudly to anyone with an accent, as if they couldn't understand English. The subtle ways she made certain passengers feel unwelcome and unworthy of basic respect. As the flight neared its end, Mark had made his decision. This issue ran deeper than one bad employee. It needed to be addressed at every level of the company. He would use this experience to spark real change, to implement new training programs, review hiring practices, and create clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. Cindy had no idea that her actions today would lead to a complete overhaul of company policy, that her bias was about to be exposed on a massive scale. As the plane began its descent, Mark allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways, and Cindy was about to learn that lesson the hard way. As the plane began its descent into New York, the cabin buzzed with activity. Passengers stowed away laptops, adjusted seats, and peered out windows at the sprawling city below. Cindy made her final rounds, collecting trash and ensuring everything was secure for landing. Her demeanor remained frosty, especially towards Mark. Mark sat quietly, observing Cindy's interactions. She offered warm farewells to the passengers she'd favored throughout the flight, but barely glanced at others. When she reached Mark's row, her lips tightened into a thin line. She held out the trash bag without a word, avoiding eye contact. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, taxiing to the gate. As passengers gathered their belongings, Mark remained seated, allowing others to deplane first. He watched Cindy's forced smile as she bid goodbye to departing travelers. Her expression changed when she noticed Mark still in his seat. Finally, Mark stood and made his way to the exit. Cindy's posture stiffened as he approached. "Have a nice day," she muttered, her tone clipped and insincere. It was clear she wanted nothing more than for Mark to leave without incident. Mark paused, meeting Cindy's gaze. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "Thank you for the interesting flight experience. I look forward to discussing it further with the appropriate parties." Cindy's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. With that cryptic farewell, Mark exited the plane. He'd maintained his composure throughout the ordeal, choosing to address the issue through proper channels rather than causing a scene. As he walked through the jet bridge, Mark pulled out his phone. It was time to set things in motion. The story of Cindy's discriminatory behavior wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Mark's patience had paid off, allowing him to gather ample evidence of her pattern of prejudice. Now he was ready to use his position to spark real change within the airline industry. As Mark entered the bustling terminal, his mind raced with plans. He'd witnessed firsthand how unchecked bias could poison the customer experience. It was time for a company-wide reckoning, starting with a thorough review of Cindy's service record. Mark was determined to transform this ugly incident into a catalyst for positive change. Mark's fingers flew across his phone screen as he strode through the airport terminal. The smell of coffee and bustling crowds faded into the background as he focused on the task at hand. He needed to act fast. "Rachel, it's Mark," he said the moment his assistant picked up. "I need you to set up an urgent meeting. HR, flight supervisors, everyone who needs to be there. Tomorrow morning, first thing." Rachel's voice crackled through the phone, all business. "Of course, sir. May I ask what this is regarding?" Mark's jaw tightened as he recalled Cindy's dismissive behavior. "We've got a situation with one of our flight attendants. I need a full review of her service record. Name's Cindy. She was on my flight today." Rachel's typing could be heard in the background. Her efficiency was both impressive and a little unsettling. It meant things were about to move very quickly. "I'll have everything ready for you, sir," Rachel assured him. "Is there anything else you need?" Mark paused, considering. "Yes, I want to be there when we address this with Cindy. Make sure that's clear to everyone involved." "Understood," Rachel replied. "I'll send you the meeting details shortly." As Mark ended the call, a mix of emotions washed over him. He was angry about the discrimination he'd witnessed, but also determined to use this as a catalyst for change. This wasn't just about one bad employee. It was about setting a new standard for the entire airline. He made his way to the parking garage, mind racing. What would Cindy's service record reveal? Had there been other complaints? How deep did this problem run? Mark's phone buzzed. Rachel had already sent the meeting invite. 9 a.m. sharp, with all the key players confirmed. Things were moving fast, and there was no turning back now. As he drove home, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's meeting would be a turning point, not just for Cindy, but for the whole company. He'd seen firsthand how unchecked bias could poison the customer experience. It was time for a reckoning. Little did Cindy know, her actions today had set in motion a chain of events that would expose far more than just her own prejudice. As Mark pulled into his driveway, he allowed himself a grim smile. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways, and Cindy was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The stage was set. Tomorrow morning, Mark would face Cindy and confront the ugly truth head-on. But first, he had a long night ahead, preparing for a meeting that would change everything. The conference room fell silent as Mark opened Cindy's personnel file. His eyes widened, scanning a history that painted a disturbing pattern. How had this behavior gone unchecked for so long? And more importantly, what would it take to finally put an end to it? Mark arrived at Dalton Airlines headquarters just before 9 a.m. The New York skyline stretched out behind him as he strode through the lobby. In the elevator, he steeled himself for the meeting ahead. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about changing the entire culture of his airline. The HR manager, Sarah, and customer service head, Tom, were already waiting in the conference room. Their faces were grim as Mark took his seat. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Mark began. "We have a serious situation to address." Mark recounted his experience on yesterday's flight, describing Cindy's dismissive behavior and the coffee incident in detail. Sarah and Tom exchanged worried glances as he spoke. When Mark finished, Tom cleared his throat. "I'm afraid this isn't an isolated incident, sir." He pushed a thick folder across the table. "This is Cindy's complete service record. There's a pattern." Mark opened the file, his frown deepening as he read. Complaint after complaint painted a picture of bias and unprofessional behavior. Many passengers had reported feeling discriminated against or treated poorly. "How is she still employed?" Mark asked, his voice tight with anger. Sarah looked uncomfortable. "Most complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Without concrete evidence, it was hard to take action." Mark's jaw clenched. This was worse than he'd imagined. Not only had Cindy's behavior gone unchecked, but the system itself was failing to protect passengers from discrimination. "That changes today," he said firmly. "I want to be there when we confront Cindy about this." Tom and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. "Sir, are you sure that's wise?" Tom asked. "It's not typical for the CEO to be involved in disciplinary meetings." "This isn't a typical situation," Mark replied. "I witnessed her behavior firsthand. I need to be there to make it clear how seriously we're taking this." After a moment of hesitation, Sarah and Tom nodded in agreement. As they prepared for Cindy's arrival, Mark couldn't shake a nagging thought. How many other employees might be engaging in similar behavior? This meeting wasn't just about Cindy anymore. It was the first step in a much larger change. The clock ticked closer to 10 a.m. when Cindy was due to arrive. Mark took a deep breath, centering himself. He was ready to confront not just one flight attendant, but a systemic problem that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Little did Cindy know her actions were about to become a turning point for the entire airline. What happens when someone who's gotten away with discrimination for years suddenly comes face to face with the consequences? As Cindy entered the room, she was about to find out. The next few minutes would determine not just her future, but the future of Dalton Airlines itself. Cindy walked in with a confident smile, her uniform crisp and her hair neatly styled. But that smile quickly faded as her eyes landed on Mark. Recognition dawned, followed by visible shock. Her face paled, and she stumbled over her words. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't expect to see you here," Cindy stammered, her eyes darting between Mark and the other executives. The realization of why she'd been called to this meeting was clearly sinking in. Mark remained calm, his voice steady as he addressed her. "Please have a seat, Cindy. We need to discuss your recent behavior on Flight DA-347, as well as some concerning patterns in your service record." Cindy sank into a chair, her posture rigid with tension. She opened her mouth, likely to offer an apology or explanation, but Mark held up a hand to stop her. "Before you say anything, I want you to understand the gravity of this situation," Mark continued. He pulled out her personnel file, laying it on the table between them. "This isn't just about one incident. We've uncovered a troubling history of complaints against you, Cindy. Complaints that suggest a pattern of discriminatory behavior." Cindy's eyes widened as she stared at the thick folder. She seemed to shrink in her seat, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. Mark leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I experienced your prejudice firsthand yesterday, but more importantly, I witnessed how you treated other passengers differently based on their appearance or background. That kind of behavior is unacceptable in any context, but especially in a service industry like ours." He paused, letting his words sink in. Cindy's face showed a mix of emotions: shame, fear, and a hint of defiance. Mark continued, his tone firm but not unkind. Respect isn't optional, Cindy. It's the foundation of everything we do here at Dalton Airlines. Every passenger, regardless of their race, clothing, or accent, deserves to be treated with dignity and kindness. Cindy finally found her voice, though it was shaky. I never meant to," she began, but trailed off, unable to form a coherent defense. Mark shook his head. "Intentions aren't enough. Your actions have consequences. They affect real people, damage our reputation, and go against everything this company stands for." As the meeting continued, Mark laid out the full extent of the complaints against Cindy. With each revelation, her demeanor shifted from shock to resignation. By the end, she sat slumped in her chair, the reality of her situation fully sinking in. Mark's final words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Now, Cindy, we need to discuss what happens next. Your future with this airline hangs in the balance. Are you ready to hear our decision?" Sometimes the most powerful lessons come at the highest cost. As Mark looked at Cindy, he knew his next words would send ripples through the entire company. But in a world where respect is non-negotiable, what price is too high to pay for justice? Mark took a deep breath, his decision weighing heavily on him. "Cindy, I've reviewed your service record extensively. This isn't just about yesterday's incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been ongoing for years. We've given you chances to improve, but the complaints keep coming. At this point, we've exhausted all other options." Cindy's face fell as the gravity of the situation sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mark continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "Respect for all our customers isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything we do at Dalton Airlines. Your actions have not only hurt individuals, but damaged our reputation as a company." He leaned forward, making eye contact with Cindy. "I want you to understand the impact of your behavior. Every time you treated a passenger differently based on their appearance or background, you made them feel unwelcome and unvalued. That's not what we stand for." Cindy nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. Mark could see the realization of her actions finally hitting home. He continued, "Given the severity and persistence of these issues, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The room fell silent. Cindy's shoulders slumped as she absorbed the news. Mark softened his tone slightly. "We're offering a severance package, which includes 2 months' salary and assistance in finding new employment. HR will go over the details with you after this meeting." To everyone's surprise, Cindy didn't protest or make excuses. She simply nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. I'm sorry for letting you down." Mark stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I hope this serves as a wake-up call, Cindy. Use this as an opportunity to reflect and grow. The airline industry may not be the right fit for you, but there's always a chance to change and do better in the future." As Cindy left the room with the HR manager, Mark turned to the remaining executives. "This isn't just about one employee. We need to look at our entire system. How did this behavior go unchecked for so long? What can we do to prevent it in the future?" The customer service head nodded in agreement. "You're right, sir. This incident has exposed some serious flaws in our reporting and accountability processes." Mark's mind was already racing with ideas. "We need to overhaul our training programs, create clearer channels for passenger complaints, and implement stricter consequences for discriminatory behavior. This is our chance to set a new standard not just for Dalton Airlines, but for the entire industry." As the executives began to discuss potential changes, Mark couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and determination. Cindy's termination was just the beginning. The real work of transforming the company's culture was about to begin. Cindy's termination was just the beginning. Mark knew that changing the culture of an entire airline would be a monumental task, but as he sat down with HR to discuss next steps, he felt a spark of determination. This ugly incident could be the catalyst for real, lasting change. Sarah from HR pulled out a thick folder. "We've compiled data on customer complaints across all our flights. The patterns are concerning." She spread out charts and graphs, each one telling a story of unchecked bias and discrimination. Mark leaned in, studying the numbers. "We've been blind to this for too long," he said, shaking his head. "How do we even begin to address such a systemic problem?" Tom, the customer service head, spoke up. "It won't be easy. The airline industry has deeply ingrained biases. Changing that will take more than just a few seminars." Mark nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "We need a complete overhaul, new training programs, clear accountability measures, maybe even anonymous reporting systems for passengers." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Actually, I've been researching some cutting-edge diversity programs. The Society for Human Resource Management found that companies with effective training saw a 20% boost in employee engagement and 30% higher customer satisfaction." "That's a start," Mark said, "but we need to go further. I want a top-to-bottom review of all our policies, hiring practices, promotion criteria, customer interaction guidelines, everything." Tom looked nervous. "That's going to ruffle some feathers. Change is always hard, especially when people don't think there's a problem." Mark's jaw set with determination. "Then we make them see the problem. We share stories, put faces to the statistics. This isn't just about numbers. It's about real people being hurt by our failures." As they continued brainstorming, the scale of the task ahead became clear. It would take months, maybe years, to truly transform the company culture. But Mark was committed. "We have a chance here," he said, standing up to pace the room. "Not just to fix Dalton Airlines, but to set a new standard for the entire industry. Imagine if we could create a truly inclusive environment where every passenger feels valued regardless of who they are." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Studies show that diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform their competitors. This isn't just the right thing to do. It's good business." As the meeting wrapped up, Mark felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The road ahead would be challenging, but the potential for positive change was enormous. "Let's get to work," he said, gathering up the plans they'd sketched out. "We've got an airline to transform." As Mark gathered those plans, a nagging question lingered in his mind. How could he ensure this transformation wasn't just a temporary fix, but a lasting change? The answer, he realized, lay in the power of speaking up. And it would start with him. Mark knew that addressing discrimination wasn't just about punishing bad behavior. It was about creating an environment where everyone felt empowered to call out injustice, no matter how small. He thought back to the coffee incident. If someone had spoken up then, how different might things have been? But Mark also understood the challenges. Speaking up isn't always easy, especially when you're not sure if others will support you. And there's a fine line between holding people accountable and giving them a chance to learn and grow. Mark wanted to create a culture of respect, not fear. That's when inspiration struck. Mark decided to share his own story with the entire company. Not as the CEO who experienced discrimination, but as a regular passenger who saw something wrong and decided to act. He wanted to show that speaking up isn't about position or power, it's about doing what's right. Mark drafted an email to all employees, detailing his experience on that flight. He described how it felt to be treated differently, and how small acts of bias can quickly escalate into something much worse. But he also emphasized the power of one person to make a difference. "We all have a responsibility to create the kind of workplace and world we want to live in," Mark wrote. "Sometimes that means having uncomfortable conversations or standing up for someone else, but every time we do, we make our company and our community a little bit better." To back up his words with action, Mark announced plans for a new anonymous reporting system. Passengers and employees alike would be able to report any instances of discrimination or bias they witnessed, without fear of retaliation. It wasn't about catching people doing wrong. It was about creating a culture of accountability and respect. As Mark hit send on the email, he felt a mix of nervousness and hope. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. There would be setbacks and challenges along the way, but he was committed to seeing it through no matter how long it took. The lessons from Mark's approach were clear. Speaking up against discrimination isn't always easy, but it's necessary. Small actions can lead to big changes, and creating a truly inclusive environment requires ongoing effort and vigilance from everyone, not just those at the top. As word of Dalton Airline's new initiatives spread, Mark couldn't help but think about the broader implications. If one company could make this kind of change, what might happen if others followed suit? Could this be the start of a larger movement towards a more just and equitable society? Mark's story was far from over. But as he looked out his office window at the bustling airport below, he felt a surge of determination. The power to create change was in their hands. All they had to do was speak up. Mark's story was just the beginning. As the plane touched down that day, countless opportunities for intervention slipped by unnoticed. The flight attendant who saw Cindy's dismissive behavior but said nothing. The passenger who witnessed the coffee incident but remained silent. Each missed chance to speak up allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked. But what if things had gone differently? Imagine if that other flight attendant had pulled Cindy aside, gently reminding her of their commitment to equal treatment. Or if a nearby passenger had offered Mark help and called attention to Cindy's actions. These small gestures could have sparked a chain reaction of kindness and accountability. Speaking up isn't easy, especially when faced with a colleague's misconduct or a tense situation. Fear of backlash or social isolation often holds people back. But research shows that when individuals feel a sense of responsibility or see others taking action, they're more likely to intervene themselves. The bystander effect is a powerful force, making people less likely to help when others are present. But clear communication and leadership can overcome this hurdle. If just one person had stood up for Mark, it might have inspired others to do the same. Airline staff had unique opportunities to address the situation. A supervisor could have noticed Cindy's pattern of behavior and addressed it privately. Co-workers could have called out microaggressions in the moment, creating a culture where bias wasn't tolerated. Even small acts of kindness towards targeted passengers could have made a big difference. The power to create change lies within each of us. Every time we challenge a discriminatory comment or offer support to someone being mistreated, we contribute to a more just society. These individual actions may seem small, but they add up to create significant shifts in culture and behavior. Campaigns that showcase real-life examples of bystander intervention can inspire others to act. Imagine if Dalton Airlines shared stories of employees who spoke up against bias, celebrating their courage and impact. This could empower more people to become active allies in the fight against discrimination. As viewers, we all have a role to play in creating a more respectful world. The next time you witness unfair treatment, remember Mark's story. Will you be the one to speak up? To offer help? To challenge the status quo? Your actions, no matter how small, have the power to create ripples of positive change. In the end, it's not just about one flight or one company. It's about building a society where everyone feels valued and respected. And that starts with each of us finding the courage to stand up for what's right, one small action at a time. The fight against discrimination isn't a one-time battle. It's an ongoing journey that requires constant vigilance and commitment from all of us. Mark's story shows how one person's actions can spark change, but lasting progress demands everyone's participation. Take a moment to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and stayed silent? Or have you spoken up and made a difference? Remember, change isn't a spectator sport. It requires active involvement from each of us. As you go about your day, keep your eyes open for opportunities to stand up against injustice, no matter how small. A kind word, a helping hand, or the courage to call out unfair treatment can create ripples of positive change. In the end, the world we want to see begins with the actions we take today.